Good morning and good evening. Welcome to the virtual villa for the first Zoom session of our symposium, The Sanctuary, Art and Literature from Exile and Hermitage. This symposium was originally scheduled to coincide with Villa Aurora's actual 25th anniversary in 2020, but due to the pandemic, we were not able to celebrate until this year. But now we're doing it in style. In Berlin, we've already presented the exhibition All the Lonely People, curated by Nana Barman and featuring several Villa Aurora artists. And this show is currently in transit to Los Angeles and will be presented at Lex Art starting December 4th. So I hope you'll join us for that as well. I would like to thank our anniversary sponsors, the German Federal Foreign Office, the Berlin Senate, the Friede Springer Foundation. And last but not least, I would like to thank the University of Southern California. This symposium was conceived and organized in close cooperation with USC Libraries. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Michaela Ullmann, the Exile Studies Librarian and Instruction Coordinator at USC Libraries, who has kindly agreed to say a few words of welcome.
Thank you, Claudia. Ladies and gentlemen, dear Villa Aurora team in Los Angeles and in Berlin. First of all, my heartfelt congratulations on this important anniversary. 25 years of Villa Aurora, what an incredible accomplishment. As the Exile Studies Librarian at USC's Feuchtwanger Memorial Library, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the series of events celebrating this important milestone in Villa Aurora's history. My colleagues at the USC Libraries and I are honored that we have been able to collaborate with Villa Aurora from its very beginning in 1995, continuing Martha Feuchtwanger's extraordinary vision to preserve and keep alive the legacy of Leon Feuchtwanger and of so many other German-speaking exiles who came to Southern California in the late 1930s and early 1940s. As many of you know, the Feuchtwanger Memorial Library at USC houses Leon and Martha Feuchtwanger's papers and part of their library, while about 20,000 books, as well as artwork and furniture, are kept on long-term loan at Villa Aurora. Beyond our shared care for Martha and Leon's material heritage, our two institutions share the deeply felt responsibility to preserve and foster the intellectual legacy of Martha and Leon Feuchtwanger. Over the years, Villa Aurora and the Feuchtwanger Memorial Library have collaborated on many important projects, such as on the conferences of the International Feuchtwanger Society and on events to celebrate the German-speaking exiles' legacy in Southern California. A collaboration that is particularly important to me on a personal level, as well as in today's political climate, is the Feuchtwanger Fellowship. Every year, in collaboration with Reporters Without Borders and PEN International, Villa Aurora and USC Libraries bring a writer, journalist, filmmaker, blogger, or any kind of other writer to Los Angeles who defends human rights in their home country and who is oftentimes persecuted or threatened for the work they do. Together, Villa Aurora and USC Libraries provide a safe haven for these writers to work in peace for a few months. And together, we connect our Feuchtwanger Fellows to local communities, activists, faculty, and students in Los Angeles. With this program, we commemorate the exile of artists and intellectuals during World War II, and together we call attention to the fact that censorship and suppression of free speech is still prevalent around the world today. Over the last 25 years, we brought 23 Feuchtwanger Fellows to Los Angeles from 22 countries, such as Sierra Leone, Belarus, Afghanistan, China, Mexico, and Syria. Please join me in congratulating the team of Villa Aurora for 25 years full of important contributions to preserving the legacy of Martha and Leon Feuchtwanger and of fostering strong artistic and intellectual exchange between Germany and the United States. And thank you for joining us for this series of events.
Yeah, thank you, Michaela. I just want to say a few words on the rest of the symposium, how we're going to proceed. Two presentations were already given in person last Saturday at Villa Aurora. Stefan Keppler-Tasaki gave the keynote address, 25 Years of Literature from the Villa Aurora, a Sanctuary of Exile and Gateway to California. And Kevin Benneman, Villa Aurora Writer-in-Residence 2008, presented Sunset Boulevard on filming, building, and dying in Los Angeles. Both of these presentations were recorded live at Villa Aurora and will be available on our YouTube channel starting November 19. Today, Stefan Keppler-Tasaki will give a short introduction into the topic and has also kindly agreed to be the moderator for the Q&A with Tanja Dückers. Tanja Dückers was Villa Aurora writer in residence in 2000, and it's an honor to have her back, even though it's only virtually at this time. Next week, we're going to have another 2 Zoom sessions that will close out the symposium. On November 15th, Felicitas Hoppe will read for us. She was writer in residence here at the Villa in 2012. She will also be in conversation with our very own Friedel Schmoranzer, Villa Aurora's head of fellowship programs, and I do hope you will join us for that. And then last, but certainly not least, on November 16th, we will close out the symposium with a lecture entitled From the Secret Wing, On the Move, Multi-Directions of Doing Literature by Annette Jael Lehmann-Kohlisch of the Freie University Berlin. She is professor for culture and media at the Institute for Theater Studies. And the Q&A with Annette Lehmann will be moderated by Friederike von Schwerin-Hay, who is professor of German and Russian and chair of German and Russian at Pomona College. You will be able to access all 4 of these sessions of the symposium on our YouTube channel from November 19th. And this information, as well as the links to sign up for the remaining Zoom sessions live, can also be found on our website. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Stefan Keppler-Tasaki, Associate Professor of Modern German Literature at the University of Tokyo and a 2019 Thomas Mann Fellow, and he will join us today from the Thomas Mann House.
Thank you so much, Claudia and Michaela, for your introduction. I would also like to thank Heike Mertens, Executive Director of Villa Aurora and Thomas Mann House in Berlin. She brought us together to mark the 25-year anniversary of Villa Aurora. As mentioned, my name is Stefan Keppler-Tasaki. I'm currently a guest at the Thomas Mann House in Pacific Palisades. The book wall right behind me actually represents a significant example of sanctuary building. It's Thomas Mann's 150-volume Goethe edition that he used to mark and shield his workspace during exile. A similar strategy of using special objects to guard one's study is visible in Brecht's habit of hanging a scroll painting of Confucius above his desk, as he did in his home in Santa Monica, only a few miles away from the home of Thomas Mann. The keyword of our symposium is sanctuary, basically an umbrella term whose notions reach from the sacred to the mundane. Even in its original Latin use, it referred to a sacred place, as well as to a private cabinet or retreat for public figures. Your home is your sanctuary has been a common phrase in American civil rights policy since the 19th century to express the inviolability of the home as an individual's place of shelter and refuge. When William Faulkner entitled his 1931 American crime novel simply Sanctuary, he referred exactly to this concept of value, but in a sarcastic way, since the characters in this work are constantly searching for places of escape and safety, until the last 2 survivors have to go as far as to Paris to find sanctuary. In an interview on this matter, Faulkner explained, "Everyone must have some secure, safe place to which she can hurry, run from trouble." Finally, a contemporary dictionary calls sanctuary a word for anywhere a person feels especially safe. Precisely this feeling or this sense of safety seems to have suffered recently due to social and environmental insecurities among them the housing crisis and flood disasters, to name just the obvious. It's for this reason that the forms and functions of sanctuary earn closer scrutiny in our symposium. In March 2020, I spent the last weeks of a 9-month sabbatical in the town of Davis near Sacramento, when the shelter-in-place order was issued by the state of California to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The definition of shelter-in-place was given as to find a safe location indoors. While staying at home might have been an easy task, it was still unusual that we had to identify our daily living quarters as a safe location. I wouldn't really know whether I would go so far as to call a sabbatical home, or any home for that matter, as a safe place. As soon as we have to speak of safety, we rather see the lack of it. And to single out a safe location marks on the same time a much vaster area of unsafety. Such dialectics are captured in the line from Brecht's Life of Galileo. Unhappy the land that needs heroes. In other words, we should need neither heroes nor sanctuaries. As mentioned by Claudia Gordon, the first session of our symposium took place in the Villa Aurora last weekend. I would like to recall some of the ideas and observations brought up that day by the participants. Firstly, sanctuary, or in German mostly Zufluchtsstätte, is a keyword of exile literature and exile studies. It occurs, for example, in how Martha and Leon Feuchtwanger conceived of their 22-room home, unreasonably large for just one couple, as a refuge, not just for them, but for friends and acquaintances too. The villa became a sanctuary to many exiles, and it has proven itself as a symbol of sanctuary and memorial of exile to this day. Furthermore, sanctuary has also been a keyword in the political self-understanding of the metropolis of Los Angeles, particularly since implementation of a sanctuary city policy in 1979 that limited the enforcement of immigration laws. In accord with its prominent part in the history of exile, LA was one of the forerunners of the sanctuary city movement that has been widely adopted by communities in contemporary America. Secondly, I was quite impressed by how participant Kevin Fenneman characterized the joint topic of two of his major works, the novel Close to Jedinev and the essay book Sunset Boulevard, as failed attempts to establish sanctuaries. The novel features a tree house built by kids who try to escape World War II violence. The essay book looks into the initial aspirations and final shortcomings of modernist architecture in Southern California. This fragile nature of sanctuaries is also highlighted in testimonies such as Brecht's 1939 poem Zufluchtsstätte, describing a fisherman's cottage with a paddle on its roof, as if the building should be able to turn into an ark. The structure is located along a strait so as to allow overseas travels. The final line features the four doors of the house as routes to escape by. The very last word, therefore, is to flee, pointing back to the title of the poem, since the German word Zuflucht entails Flucht, that is, flight. The word sanctuary does not work like this directly, but it frequently calls for the phrasing sunken sanctuary. Thirdly and finally, one of the participants, a student of filmmaking, told me how convincing it seemed to him to describe Los Angeles as a theme park of risks. The LA area has many theme parks to offer, such as Disneyland and Universal Studios. But the whole metropolis, too, can be seen as one, considering its variety of risks, such as earthquakes, wildfires, landslides, and floodings. Alongside its history of exile and sanctuary, Los Angeles has often been described, most prominently in the tradition of LA Noir, as a landscape of trauma that keeps creating and recreating scenarios of escape. This particular phrasing, theme park of risks, can be found in Tanja Dückers' newspaper article Weimar an der Westküste, published in November 2005, to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the residence program at Villa Aurora. On this note, I would like to introduce our main speaker today, Tanja Dückers. Born in Berlin, she has published 18 books, including poetry collections such as Morsezeichen and Fireman, both in 1996, novels such as Spielzone in 1990, Himmelskörper in 2003, and Hausers Zimmer in 2010, as well as essay volumes such as Morgen nach Utopia and Über das Erinnern in 2007 and 2008, respectively. Another essayistic book of hers, A Cultural History of Confectionery, entitled Das süße Berlin, will soon be released by Surkamp. A global citizen and committed resident of Berlin, she talks about socio-political topics and is present on many stages in Germany and abroad. She has lived for several years in the United States and in Spain. Fellowships and teaching assignments have taken her, a trained literary scholar and art historian, to Los Angeles, Oxford, Ohio, Oberlin, Ohio, Amsterdam, Bucharest, and many other places. Also, she's a prolific journalist for outlets such as Zeit Online, and she has engaged in several civic initiatives, notable among them Weiter Schreiben, meaning keep writing, a forum for literature and music from crisis areas. In the summer of the millennium, she was a fellow of the Villa Aurora. Her skillful and moving novel, Der längste Tag des Jahres, the longest day of the year, published in 2006, reflects not least ways of life in the American West. Now, please let us welcome Tanja Dückers. Over to you, Tanja.
Thank you so much for these introductory words. Good morning and good evening also from my side. I'm happy to read to you now my essay called Safe.Space. And before we decided that I'm going to read the largest part of the essay now, then Stefan and me will have a talk, and then I'm going to read the end, a shorter part of the essay. Thank you very much. Safe.Space. Long before the term was widely used, the Villa Aurora was a sanctuary place, both for Leon and Martha Feuchtwanger and some of its other guests, that enabled the exchange of ideas in a protected location. It is still a sanctuary place today, not least because of the Feuchtwanger Fellowship program, which invites many persecuted and threatened writers to work and reside in Los Angeles. Here, for their protection, they often live in undisclosed locations. Some of them remain in the US after their fellowship comes to an end. However, the majority of the writers who have resided here in Pacific Palisades since the villa underwent renovations are at worst fleeing from a cultural establishment in Germany that is often experienced as stressful, resentful, competitive, or from their own family life at home in order to concentrate on their writing. For this reason, two very different types of writers are invited to the Villa Aurora. Those who are currently successful in Germany and those who are currently being persecuted in their home countries. During my fellowship at the Villa, summer 2000, as Stefan said, It was the Algerian writer Sine Blauidi who was given refuge in Los Angeles for a year as a writer in exile. Blauidi, who once said, "Ne pas céder au poids de la peur," don't give in to the weight of your fear, has since been rehabilitated and is now professor of Arabic literature in Algiers. Yet fear, even if not so dominant, still remained her constant companion. In December 2020, she wrote, "My heart is terrified, a fish lost in the sea, awaiting a tear falling from the sky. The gift of a virgin cloud, fleeing the fire, the cinders, and the storm." One evening, I read from Leon Feuchtwanger's diaries and adopted his perspective. The descriptions of his internment in southern France are unforgettable to me. Yet, apart from briefly slipping into this role, I was one of the lucky ones who had only come to LA to do research for a book. In order to imagine what those who have to leave everything behind experience, it has been helpful to me in recent years to remember my own experiences of foreignness and non-belonging, and then to imagine that these experiences would have to be multiplied by an XXX factor in order to make the unimaginable even somewhat a little bit comprehensible. That is why I would like to report here about experiences in everyday life that the strangeness of another European country or life in the US can bring with it. I will then talk about how they relate to safe spaces. For each country listed, I will limit myself to a few experiences of foreignness, of non-belonging. In doing so, I do not claim to say anything that is broadly applicable or even correct about the respective country. The experience of strangeness and loneliness is always highly subjective. And in all of my stays abroad, some of them lasting several years, I had always, to quote Hildegard Knef, the luxury of a suitcase in Berlin. What kind of psychological padding for one's well-being this knowledge signifies can hardly be described. There were countless situations in which I thought, thank God, I don't always have to endure this, or fortunately, I'll be back in Berlin for Christmas. I start with the Czech Republic. I have spent twice several months in Prague. To this day, I remain in close contact with people, well, with friends, meanwhile, friends and colleagues in the Czech capital. Nevertheless, if I had to have stayed there without a return ticket, I would have been absolutely miserable. There's a scale that shows a language's difficulty level. The scale is Germanocentric, though it does not claim otherwise. Its purpose is to indicate how difficult it is for someone with German as a mother tongue to learn another language. Czech is only level 3 out of 6, with Arabic and Chinese as the lone level 6 languages. Conversely, this also says something about how difficult it must be for someone with Arabic as their mother tongue to pick up German. In short, my 2 Czech adult education courses did not help me at all. The notion that my home country would be taken away from me overnight and that I would be condemned to cope with everyday Czech life, meaning also to have to publish in Czech, would have been nightmarish. Nuances, humor, sensibilities, fine-tuning, quick-wittedness. Even after many years, I would not have been able to master all this to a degree where I would feel comfortable in my own skin. I only know one German woman, also a writer, who, after living in the region Bohemia for more than 15 years, speaks Czech to some extent without an accent, but even she, to this day, does not dare to write, to publish in Czech, after 15 years in being married with a Czech. As a result, my circles in Prague were mainly limited to Czechs who spoke good German or English. But it was not only due to language that my contacts within my social life and milieu were limited. If you don't drink alcohol, you can't gain a foothold in Czech society because the centerpiece, the place to get to know each other, to exchange, to flirt, to bicker over politics, to make deals is the hospodar or the pivnice. That is to say, the pub. Another word for pub is krčma, which I can't even pronounce properly. It's 4 consonant, 1 vowel. Just as the Inuit have 20 different words for snow, the Czechs have many words for pub. They play a role that cannot be overestimated, as Jaroslav Rudy's brilliant contemporary novels illustrate. Life becomes even more difficult if you're also vegetarian. Despite environmentally friendly trends and UFA-like vegan eateries in Prague's Americanized city center, these kinds of diets and lifestyles have not really arrived in Czech society. I would have always been an outsider there with my herbal teas. The disapproving expression on my Czech exchange colleague Iva Perkakova's face will never be forgotten. One that severely disproved of the fact that she couldn't properly booze with me. Poland. While the Czech Republic is a very secular country, the neighboring country Poland is known to be deeply Catholic. Naive as I was, my mindset when I was on the cusp of going to Krakow for 6 months was, oh, things will be quite different in the modern, enlightened cultural scene. How much arrogance there was in this notion of mine. I happened to be in Krakow at a particularly significant moment in the recent history of Poland, when Pope John Paul II fell seriously ill and eventually died. In Germany, one cannot imagine how the Poles suffered along with their Pope for weeks, how much he and the state of his health dominated the conversation. Even the hippest people I knew called the Pope a dear old bear whom from the bottom of their hearts they wished would get back on his feet. He's like a grandpa to them all. It is inconceivable that young German artists would have said something like that about Pope Benedict XVI. When the Pope finally died of uremic sepsis, half of Krakow marched through the city in a magnificent, touching, medieval-looking mourning procession. It was moving. However, I felt like an actress. But not attending the funeral march would have offended my host deeply. What must it be like for someone who comes to Germany from a distant country when even I, to some extent, feel very out of place in neighboring Poland? The Netherlands. The Netherlands was the easiest country for me to immerse myself in. Amsterdam is cosmopolitan and multicultural, probably one of the most tolerant cities in the world. And yet there have been and still are many micro experiences that make it clear to me that I don't belong there either. Since the Netherlands is in many aspects a more progressive country than Germany, at least to my mind, I became aware of my own traditionalism and narrow-mindedness, certain thought patterns of mine that are not so flattering. A Dutch friend smiled indulgently when I confessed to her that although I had left the Catholic Church, I occasionally had sentimental reflexes relating to it, such as tears welling up in my eyes when I heard certain hymns. In terms of social structure, the Netherlands is much more secular than Germany. Here, it would be unthinkable to collect church taxes or have church kindergartens, where in Germany, 90% of them are subsidized by the state. I also didn't always cope well with the enlightened directness of the Dutch. Eating, sleeping, illness and death, sex, humor, in everyday conversation, everything is as plain and clear as the country's landscape itself. Pragmatism in the Netherlands sometimes tests this old-fashioned romantic aesthete from the country's eastern neighbor. Ketchup bottles were placed on nicely laid tables next to the silverware, and along with them, extremely ugly utensils that reminded one of plungers for unclogging toilets. These are used to remove the last ounce of ketchup from the bottles. From an ecological point of view, it is, of course, advisable to scoop out all that is left, even by candlelight. Catalonia, Spain. When I think of the 3 years that I lived in Barcelona, in addition to many wonderful memories, I also think of the many hurdles I was confronted with in the cultural sector as a known Catalan. From Berlin, I was used to a certain permeability of the social classes. Perhaps it is due to the break with the past that was brought about by the Second World War. However, there hasn't been, nor is there, a homogeneous, self-contained group in Berlin that has dominated the city's fate in politics, economy, and culture for decades. Everyone knows about corruption, of course, but there are also vacancies and opportunities for advancement, career changes, and surprises in Berlin. Artists from different countries come to Berlin, make careers there, and often only speak English. Not so in Barcelona. Anyone who did not come from a long-established Catalan family could not become anything in the cultural sector at the turn of the millennium. Viva Catalunya! And if you don't speak Catalan perfectly, you had no chance anyway. In fall 1999, when I had only been in Spain for 6 weeks, the Goethe Institute Barcelona arranged for me to go on the regional broadcaster Radio Catalunya to give an interview on the 10th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. I had prepared myself thoroughly for the interview, but then it turned out that as a Berliner, I was expected to give the interview in fluent Catalan. Castellano was not accepted. Well, I was sent home and the segment was cancelled. It was also very difficult to comprehend who was taking what stance on the independence movement. Everywhere I turned, I came across strange, unexpected alliances. Terms like left and right had already become vague in Germany. In Spain, they had become completely fluid. Tourists may manage without taking a position, but you can't get away with that if you have lived and worked in Catalonia, as I did for several years. Now we jump to Romania, Transylvania, Romania. A journey back into time. I took the train to Transylvania via Dresden, Prague, Brno, Vienna, Bratislava, and Budapest. A long enough of journey that, after leaving behind language regions where Czech or Hungarian are spoken, I suddenly hear German again, albeit one that has a different sound to it. And then I saw cattle, wild meadows, the Carpathian mountains, fortresses, people on horses, farmers, on horses. Sometimes you feel like you have been transported back 100 years. Shepherds herding sheep through the village, shepherds who are still wary of electricity. And every village is different. The village community matters a lot. As a Berliner, you're a complete stranger here. In Katzendorf, the village of a mere 2,000 souls, where I could have lived for a year in an old rectory, I realized that I would never have been able to belong simply because I wasn't born there. My sympathy for the many Roma, who make up around 80% of Katza's population, betrayed that I was a privileged person from a wealthy country where there are fewer struggles for distribution and where this attitude doesn't cost me anything. And then there was this as well. Nowhere in Europe I have met so many mentally wounded, devastated people as in Romania. Decades after the end of the Ceausescu dictatorship, the effects of its hardship on society were still clearly noticeable. There were people who shouted at each other during my readings, who accused each other of having betrayed them to the Securitate, that's the Department of State Security, and in consequence of being responsible for them being imprisoned for years. Furthermore, there were terrible stories of people my age who as children lost their siblings to diseases such as bronchitis, pneumonia, or pelvic inflammation because there were no antibiotics in one of the poorest countries in Europe. Again and again, there was this feeling to have been so lucky without doing anything for this on my own, to have had it easier for no reason. Well, I stay in the southeast of Europe, Belgrade, Serbia. Belgrade, ruins from the Second World War next to ruins from NATO bombing. Peter Handke. At the time that he was awarded the Nobel Prize, I was in Belgrade as a fellow of the Goethe Institute and the Serbian Writers Association Krokodil. It is hard to understate how differently the Serbians and the Germans viewed this decision. Enthusiastic Serbs hugged me and congratulated me. Friends back home in Berlin expressed their horror over the phone. Handke, the hero and bridge builder. Handke, the weirdo who lost his way politically, who drifted to the right. My attempt to take a mediating stance in this debate was welcomed neither here nor there. Suddenly, I didn't seem to belong either at home or abroad. But then there was Mila, the librarian from the Goethe Institute Belgrade, whom I befriended, a native Serb who, during the hail of the bombs in 1999, was pregnant and feared for her life. The house next to hers was completely destroyed. Yet she loves Berlin, Germany, and the German language, which she speaks very well. On my return flight to Schönefeld Airport in Berlin, there are many young people on board who want to try to gain a foothold in Niemiecka in Germany. Everyone who can leaves the country. The director of the Goethe Institute Belgrade is ashamed. Now we, with our language courses, are also promoting the brain drain. Damn it. And I, as a writer, I'm a piece of this mosaic. Now, a jump over the ocean. USA. The US is where I've spent the most time outside of Germany, altogether several years. The diversity of the country, its short history, for comparison, the Transylvanian Saxons have 800 years of history in Romania. The fact that so many people come from elsewhere made it easier to get one's bearings than in many other countries. Since I had already lived in the US when I was a schoolgirl, many things were familiar to me. Oversized things, car culture, being nice. None of that seemed strange to me, even though I come from Berlin, where being nice is quickly seen as inauthentic, disagreeable. However, in the US, I also had unique experiences with being a stranger and being different. As part of a students' exchange, I had first lived in Pennsylvania for 6 months. Many Americans with German heritage live in Pennsylvania, who, to some extent, have nostalgic notions of Germany. Accordingly, I was often confronted with positive prejudice. For example, when to the surprise of my teacher, I was a failure in physics class. She couldn't account for it. Germans have produced many Nobel Prize winners in physics and chemistry, she told me with a frown. I was also immediately assigned a cleanup task because you love order. I can't forget how the one daughter of my host family was jealous of me because, as a newcomer, I came home from school with better grades than she did. You always analyze everything, she accused me when I was still thinking about this and that in the car on the way to school. I won't forget this. You always analyze everything. Unfortunately, I wasn't funny enough for her. I didn't share the family's enthusiasm for watching horror films in the evening, which even included all the children and the dog. When I was crying after watching a terrible film in which a man used an axe to split the head open of everyone who comes toward him, I was introduced to a psychologist. She is too afraid of life. The psychologist was supposed to give me a training in desensitization, the goal of which was to make me capable of watching horror films without getting upset or feeling revulsion. The father of the family, a doctor, made up something about the German Angst, with which I was probably afflicted and which I had to be cured of. The therapy was unsuccessful, and to this day, I still hate watching horror movies. After my host parents' marriage imploded and the situation there became unbearable, I moved in with a different host family in South Carolina. Here, the host father, a worker at Michelin tires, made a few well-intentioned remarks about German engineers, but accepted that I was more interested in subjects other than physics and math. In South Carolina, I went to a high school where African Americans made up half the students' body. Coming from multicultural Berlin with Turkish, Greek, and Yugoslav children in my class and neighborhood, I assumed that racism would no longer be a big issue in the mid-80s. I was wrong about that, of course. By the way, also about Berlin, of course. When the African American kids got on, my school bus would be stopping in other not so swanky areas. In my high school of 1,000 students, there was only one mixed couple. It was strange for me to see the invisible dividing lines that still ran between children who attended the same school. As a newcomer, I didn't understand these boundaries and overlooked them. On the school bus, I sat in front near Kamiko, an African-American bus driver, and talked to her. But the other white girls sat in the back, preferably on the long back seat with the best view. That was implicitly a section reserved for them. Decades after Rosa Parks, there was still a kind of demarcation line on the bus. As a visiting professor in the United States decades later, I was involved in seminars in which African American students would sit down separately, rejecting being mixed with white students in their ranks. In light of a racist history, which continues to this day, and in the wake of identity politics, this may be understandable, but it is still deeply sad. Coming back to Alan Kamiko. I had a very embarrassing experience with Alan that put a damper on our incipient friendship. My host family, who voted Democrat and thus belonged to a progressive minority in the so-called Peach State, South Carolina, forbade me from inviting her to visit me sometime after school. The reason? They didn't want the neighbors to see it. It was very uncomfortable for me having to convey this to Alan. But the boomerang quickly returned. A week later, I wanted to invite over a classmate, a girl from Iran. My host mother put in a lot of effort and cooked fantastic food for the young Persian from a good family, as she put it. But my classmate said no to me at school that day and, for her part, squirmed as she gave her explanation. Her parents had forbidden her to go to the home of an American family. So I wasn't allowed to meet either friend after school. Instead, I stayed home and spent my time in the garden next to the pool with no one to accompany me but Jessica, the 8-year-old daughter, and Sam, my host family's big dog. It was pure suburbia. A trip to New Orleans in 1998 was also disconcerting, especially a visit to some of the manors of the area's former plantation owners. We visited villas that were most unspectacular for Europeans. Here and there, we were able to admire an old chest, a beautifully upholstered chair, or a mirror set in gold. Anyone who has visited Charlottenburg Palace can do without a visit to these houses. From the American point of view, however, they were marvelous. I insolently took the liberty of asking our guide about the welfare of the slaves who had worked for the owner of this house. In an abrasive tone that was unusual by American standards, she responded that the slaves had fared very well there. With a sweeping gesture, our guide pointed from the top floor of the house to the fields in front of us. The slaves would have had their huts out there somewhere, where they were also allowed to dance and sing. All of this is only a good 20 years ago. Anyone today who demonstrates, topples monuments, and loots, despite all the criticism of violent behavior, grew up in this America. 2 years later, in the summer of 2000, I was a fellow at Villa Aurora. The villa, Pacific Palisades. Even back then, it all felt like a movie. The perpetuated cinematic moment that lasted for 3 months canceled out any feeling of foreignness. Nonetheless, there were also some tears in the film. Once I got lost and ended up in South Central with the composer Charlotte Seiter, who is still a close friend to this day. In the middle of the street, there were homeless people in filthy sleeping bags. Not just a few, as one sees here and there, well, quite often in Berlin, but several hundred. Later, Joachim Bernauer, who was the director of Villa Aurora at the time, told us that one shouldn't stop in these neighborhoods, but instead drive through the red traffic lights. I grew up in Berlin, near Zoo Station. During the 1970s, my parents would first pick up any syringe on the playgrounds before letting us children romp around in them. Everyone was talking about Christiane F., a famous drug addict at that time. We had the wall right in front of our faces and were harassed at border crossings. I didn't grow up in an idyllic world, but South Central and other parts of LA were different. Here, the respective worlds hardly came into contact with one another anymore. What afflicted me in Los Angeles, despite all the magic, was also a feeling of agoraphobia. After 3 months, I was physically missing the narrow European urban fabric that a city such as Berlin, destroyed, dismembered, scared, and long divided, had evidently been able to convey. An urban security, such as the kind Manhattan exudes, with its buildings like protective shields, was hard to find here. That was exciting and nice for a limited time, but then it became painful. For one whole evening, a helicopter hovered above the villa within 1 street as it searched for someone and spiraled itself into my sleep. Even the fire alarm system, always ready to go off after the food had burned just a little, made one fearful. In the fall of 2001, I was living in the US as a writer in residence. Being there on September 11th made me feel a strong connection with the United States. However, when people who are otherwise nice to you are seriously afraid of themselves and their loved ones, when there is real distress, then you suddenly no longer belong. But the strangest conversations I had back then in 2001, not on the shore of Lake Erie, but by phone with friends in Berlin. Why do you worry about a few thousand dead Americans? Just as many people die of malaria every day in Africa, said one friend. Another friend took the same line. Well, one of the planes had crashed just 50 miles from my Pennsylvania college with a student's uncle and aunt on board. Now I was too America-friendly in Berlin and too European in the US. So I'm stopping now. And after our conversation, I'll read the shorter part about called Safe.Space America. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Tanja, for your beautiful presentation so far. For the sake of variety, we can have a short interview now. I've just 2 questions for you. The first one, at our opening event on Saturday, one of the speakers, Stephen Levine, made the point that residence stays have a meaningful and a lasting impact on the connections that writers make, connections to other artists, to cultural managers, and so on. Would you agree to that?
Well, it depends, of course, on the place where you have been and on, how much you are embedded in the cultural life there. There are like very different scholarships. And I must say, when I was at the Villa Aurora, we were really introduced to people there. There was like an introductory event and an event at the end of the 3 months where we presented our works. So you were really made to meet people. But it really depends. There are also scholarships where you're alone for 1 month in a house on your own and you are never meeting anybody. So there are really different ideas, different concepts of scholarships. But in the case of the Villa Aurora, for example, and it's 21 years ago that I've been there, I'm still close friends with the 2 other artists that stayed there with me, with the already mentioned Charlotte Seiter, a composer, and with Achim Monet, a visual artist from Cologne. And so it depends also on the time you spend there. In 3 months, I think it's a good span of time, because you really busy yourself with the art, the other scholars, the other fellows are working on. You have enough time simply, and also you have enough time to engage yourself in the city. And I mean, of course, LA is not so easily accessible, so it makes sense that you are there for 3 months and not just for a month, as like many residencies in Europe, you just go there for a month, which is generally, I think, not enough time, because you need at least 1 week to get acquainted. And in the last week, you're kind of already a little bit excited and preparing your return. So there's not so much of a time span to really concentrate on the new home, the new place where you are. But well, as I said, it depends, and it depends also on the motive. Do you just want to seek a peaceful, isolated place to concentrate on your literary work? Or are you open to your environment? Do you want to meet people? Well, I can just talk about or speak for myself. Also, like when I went to Prague, to Krakow, to Romania, and also to Belgrade, staying in Eastern Europe, Middle Eastern Europe, I was really interested in these countries, the changes there, the society. And also in Prague, I made really friendships with writers there. And in the last years, where there were so many questions about the character of the European Union, about the goals, what holds us together, and all these questions arising in the last years, it was so interesting for me to be in close contact with writers from Prague, from Krakow, from Belgrade, and in Romania. I have visited Romania many times also because I was so moved by this country. And these personal contacts they are often stemming from scholarships. And so I think definitely it makes sense to have these programs, but you see that sometimes it's the setup, the concept is working a bit better than in other cases. So one has to differentiate. Let's put it like this.
Very, very diplomatic of you. Thank you for elaborating on this. Well, you already mentioned your stay in Pennsylvania. You took us from Transylvania to Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And my other question, therefore, and as I also mentioned in my introduction, you've been at least twice a visiting professor at academic institutions in Ohio. And I take it that you've occupied yourself with writing a novel about Trumpism in the Midwestern region of the United States. Could you tell us a little more about this current project of yours?
Oh, thank you so much for this question. I've been twice in Ohio for a couple of months, and also, well, Pennsylvania is not as adjacent, and I've lived there as a school kid, and also later I was teaching at Allegheny College, and there I was in 2001. And so this whole area, I think, is I sort of feel a strong connection to it. And from spending so much time there, and also this time of the election campaign in 2016. I stayed at Oberlin College and experienced Trump's victory there on November 8th. This really was a very impressive and special time for me, to put it like this. And so the idea to write about this for a German market, and to also with the intention to confront Germans also with the quite you in Germany, in the kind of cultural scene, in the intellectual scene, I think there's a quite strong sense of anti-Americanism. And this is something that kind of busies me, or I'm thinking a lot about this. And being often in the States, my view is a bit different, of course. And my view on the US is more positive than, and so the idea to write about this rise of Trump has to do with the idea to somehow mediate between the countries. So, of course, it's very difficult when you write a novel, when you work on an artistic project and you have a moral issue. This itself is a dangerous construction. I'm aware of this, but it doesn't keep me from following this project. I started in 2017 to work on it. I've written quite a lot. I've returned in 2018 to do deeper research on this. I also went to Detroit and visited special places that play a part in my novel. But basically, it has to do with the big discrepancy I came across in Ohio between this kind of UFO-like Oberlin, which Oberlin is usually referred to as a little Portland. And I'm talking about Oberlin after our conversation a little bit, and then you have Oberlin and the college, the famous college, and the students there, and I mean it's really a leftist place. And then out of Oberlin you have the trucks and the cornfields, and the contrast is so big. And I remember my students there telling me after the election, and of course my students, they were all wonderful, and music is very important at the many students at Oberlin College. They are taking classes in opera singing, and it's like this kind of one of the focuses on in Oberlin College. One of the why students go to Oberlin College is the very great classical music. What you are able to learn there. But my students, they told me, we didn't know that there are so many people, that these people exist who would vote for Trump. We never saw them. This I won't forget, how my one student, who also, she spoke wonderfully German, and she was she wanted to follow a career as an opera singer, and she told me that she has never seen these people, and this was so impressive. It was really the symbol for this notion of the flyover state, and I had so many interesting encounters there. And I spoke also with many people who voted for Trump. And when you went to your hairdresser, or for example, the one teacher of my son who went to elementary school there, she was a supporter of Trump. So I met people from these two worlds, the Oberlin professors and students, and the people out of this bubble. And this was just so very impressive. And when I came back to Berlin, people here told me all the Americans are all crazy, and this is a terrible country. And why did they voted for Trump? And there was this, it was like the anti-American sentiment was, of course, really like, it's no limit to that. And so talking to these different people, and also thinking about why did so many people vote for Trump, not because of being in favor of him, but because of not wanting to have Hillary Clinton. This was in many conversations I had with people out of the Oberlin bubble. This was a strong point. And yeah, I did research on this, on misogyny, and about, well, why are there 20% of Americans who say they simply don't want a woman for president? It doesn't matter who, but 20%. I mean, so yeah, these are just some ideas behind this novel. And the novel is split into 3 perspectives. One of young student, kind of representative of Oberlin's student body. And she's coming across, she's meeting a worker in a car rental service. So this is somebody out of the bubble, and he is more of a Trump supporter. And as I said, I met many of these people. And then there's also the perspective from outside, from abroad. There is somebody from Germany who is living there for a limited amount of time. And these 3 people meet and have difficult relations with each other. And this is sort of the setup of the novel. I wrote a 3rd part of it but I'm not satisfied with it yet. But that's always with me like this. And this being not satisfied is, of course, a good motor, a good motivation for continuing. And but what's difficult about this novel, one of the challenges I have is that there are always new news. There's always something about Trump, about the transatlantic relations, about the German stance towards the US. I'm writing, it's not a historic topic of the 19th century, like under glass, but it's something we are dealing with now and which is in the news all the time. And so I have really decided that I write about this election campaign, about the year 2016, and not about later not about the time after, not about the Trump government. And it's really a novel with these characters, and it's not like a history book, but it's quite challenging.
I see. Thanks a lot, Tanja, for giving us this insight into your workshop. I'm really looking forward to the publication of this novel. And I would like just to point to this novel of yours that contains in its 5th chapter insights into United States. I enjoyed that a lot. Well, as you also made quite clear, you developed close ties to Eastern European countries. And I wonder how concerned you are about the current situation at the Polish border. Would you like to take a stance on that?
Oh, thank you so much for this question. Yeah, actually talking here about exile and about the being abroad, being somewhere else. I'm, of course, aware of the fact that I'm really writing from a very, very privileged perspective, and that it's, of course, absolutely not possible to compare my micro experiences of being foreign, of not belonging, of loneliness, or even distress. I mean, it's ridiculous, of course, to compare this with what other people who are seeking asylum experience. I hope I made this clear enough in my essay. But I'm very worried about the situation now. And we are here. I'm here in Berlin, and to the distance to the Polish border, it's a day trip, not more than this. I mean, with the airplane, you're in half an hour in Warsaw, and with the train in 5 hours. And then Warsaw is quite in the east of Poland, so it's really not far. That I would like to stress. and also I think that Europe is or should prove itself here in this situation, and not just blame Lukashenko. It's of course legitimate to do this, but we also have to support the Polish here and help them. And I'm very worried about when I read newspapers like the NZZ, and I'm reading that we should discuss if pushbacks shouldn't be legal. Until now, they are illegal, but there's instead of working on ideas how we can help out the people there. I mean, one has to know it's about 4,000 people in these where they are on Polish ground. So it's always said it's a nowhere land. It's not a nowhere land. It's Polish ground. It's EU EU, and now we have minus temperature there, and people have already died. And this is just like, let's say, 8 hours from Berlin. So that's something, what's in the news now, and which really worries me a lot. And I'm a bit shocked about the discussions we have here now about the pushbacks and about the disaster of Angela Merkel's politics and her welcoming culture. I mean, it's interesting to view how the public opinion changed what concerns Angela Merkel's stance. And that, like when you remember the welcoming culture in 2015 and how it's viewed now and what change it underwent, I'm not saying that one shouldn't have a differentiated view on this. And of course, there are many questions, also logistical ones, which have to be solved. But to discuss now, where people are dying here 8 hours from Berlin, that pushbacks should be legal, forgetting that people have a right to seek asylum. It's a right, a guaranteed right. It should be. This is quite shocking for me. And in this context, I would also like, I'm a member of Amnesty International, and I would like to remind of the ideas that Amnesty also has proposed to establish so-called transit centers in the countries where the people from which the countries start and for which the people who are leaving their countries where they are still living before going on a very dangerous trip, and to allow the people to seek for asylum, to apply for asylum from their countries, whether Syria, whether Algeria, whether Iraq, and so on, to apply for asylum from there and not go on a life-threatening journey. This, I think, was important for me to add when I talk here about my fellowships here and there and my sometimes unpleasant sentiments.
Right.
Yeah.
Many thanks, Tanja, for your statement on this present issue and pressing matter.
Yeah.
Well, would you like to proceed with your reading?
Yeah. Just because you, thank you for lifting up my novel, Der längste Tag des Jahres. Just to come back quickly to that, I forgot that I wanted to say something about this, because actually I do have to thank the Villa Aurora for being able to write this book. The last chapter, which makes up about a third part of the book, is set in the southwest of the US, in California, Nevada, Arizona, and Utah. And it's an example for me that sometimes you write something or you return to something, to a research work you have done, or to experiences, to places you have seen on a scholarship. And in the moment where you have been there, you didn't think yet, oh, I'm going to use it that way, or I'm writing exactly that chapter. I hadn't this clear idea. Actually, I applied with another project for the scholarship. And then I well, that can happen when you're an artist, a writer. Then I changed my mind, and I was so flashed, surprised, impressed by what I experienced in the Southwest of America, the research work I did in the 3 months where I stayed at the villa, that I wrote something different. And in 2007, this book was published, which also shows one has to be patient with artists, with writers. I was in the villa in the year 2000, and then, well, I came back for one research. But sometimes it takes time, and you do use the material you find, sometimes in different ways than you anticipate or you believe in the beginning, or what you wrote in an application, because really the real life, the real experience you make has influence on your artwork, and it can't be all conceived before. So let me add this. But actually, this book would not have been written without my stay in Los Angeles.
That's a good point too, and that seems to be happened a lot. That well, people have to apply, artists have to apply with a certain project, normally related to the place of the residence stay, and they often seem to change their plans. I remember, for example, that Bernadette Conrad as well as Jan Brandt planned to write emigre novels, novels about German emigration to the United States from the 19th century onwards, and they came out with other, but also very convincing projects. And it's always interesting how these residence stays merge into each other, right? So in combinations, for example, between stay at Villa Massimo and Villa Aurora, there happens also interactions between the inspirations writers and artists can get from that kind of stays. Right, but shall we proceed with your reading?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm proceeding with the last chapter of my essay, a lot shorter than the other part. Safe.Space, America of Sanctuaries and Pink Triangles. In the fall of 2016, during the final stretch of the election campaign that ended in Trump's victory, I was teaching at Oberlin College in Ohio. In the small town of 8,000 people, there are several bike rental shops, vegan shops, boutiques with tie-dyed clothing, yoga studios, and an astonishing number of small theaters and other stages. Because of this, Oberlin has also been described as a small version of Portland. Here, the audience is greeted at theater performances with ladies and gentlemen and everybody in between. However, what the left-wing Oberlin College is famous for is the fact that it was the first college in the nation that allowed African Americans to study there, decades before the Civil War in 1835. Today, LGBTQI rights are a top priority at Oberlin College. Cross-dressers walk across campus in large numbers with the same naturalness that trucks rumble across the cornfields a few miles away. During other stays in the US, I became aware of the pink triangles, the Safe.Space stickers, but never saw as many anywhere else as I did in Oberlin. To begin with, these little Safe.Space stickers on the doors of professors and staff have something touching and absurd about them. This is because the security that they declare cannot truly be guaranteed. The places are only declared to be safe. In these confident declarative campaigns, the Americans are way ahead of Germans, if this is to be understood as something progressive. In the US, people do not like to refer to the state, but hang up a sign that is supposed to be effective ipso facto. And it often is. In Germany, on the other hand, people like to trust official seals of approval. Next to the door of our son's daycare center at the time hung a sign that said, House of Little Researchers, Land of Ideas, Federal Republic of Germany. In the daycare center, they did a little arts and crafts once in a while, and the children were allowed, amazingly, to look into a kaleidoscope. Nothing differentiated this facility from others without a seal of approval from the Federal Republic of Germany. But the trust of the parents visiting the facility for the first time increased enormously. But the American safe space culture raised the question of who has to be protected from whom here, and whether such enclosures and perimeters might actually restrict freedom for both sides. Borders always work in two directions. Safe space, but for whom? When I was a writer in residence and lecturer at Dartmouth College, New Hampshire, I forgot, I've also been to New Hampshire, a venerable Ivy League institution, a professor invited me into his office. It was to discuss a reading I was to give as part of his seminar. He was a pleasant, amiable, extremely polite colleague who was probably nearing 70. I had already met his wife. When I entered the office, I automatically closed the door. It was noisy in the hallway as the college's basketball team had just won a game. The professor kindly asked me to leave the door open. This is for his and my safety, so that one of us cannot claim to have been sexually molested by the other. The college policy. I was flabbergasted. So the safe space was actually an unsafe space with evil lurking inside it. Of course, people, especially women, have found themselves in situations that they did not expect to occur. The rule also serves to protect both sides. Every year, thousands of lawsuits are filed in the US that are difficult to prove and which can quickly result in someone not only losing their job, but also their house, their car, everything. Nevertheless, these regulations were wrapped like a lead ring around what was intended to be a casual conversation. And it was loud because of the basketball players. Anyone entering a room marked with safe space, whether with the door open or closed, crosses into a gray area and not a landscape of pink clouds. This is because unjust grades, as well as preferential treatment and advantages in the awarding of grants and project applications and so on, racism and sexism beyond the macro level, all of this continues to occur, of course. Decision makers are often unconsciously moved by racist, sexist, misogynist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, and other discriminatory attitudes, even toward men, whites, and so on. And no sticker, no sign protects against that. The only thing that is quickly pursued here is symbolic politics. But my first reaction when I viewed the pink triangle was, how sad that actual normal behavior only seems to be guaranteed in a protection zone that's been specially marked for this purpose. Even if it is not intended, here something is declared to be an exceptional case, one that you wish would be more than an exception. This not only damages such behavior's claim to universality, it also comprises all compromises all unmarked rooms and places them under general suspicion. There are indeed professors or other employees who, for whatever reason, perhaps dislike of the ubiquitous rampant stickeritis, do not stick such a declaration on their door. Unfortunately, the safe spaces are, of course, not only threatened from within, though the abuse of power on one side or the other, they also expose the people in the room in a clearly visible manner to the enemies of these ideas. Those who are concerned about real security sometimes prefer to do without the eye-catching sign. For example, the writer in exile at the villa. In addition, the pink triangle immediately reminds me as a German of the badges that the Nazis used to mark homosexuals in concentration camps. Safe Space Berlin. During my stays abroad, which sometimes lasted several years, there was always a safe space for me, my hometown of Berlin. I came back to Berlin, which is changing but always surprisingly remains true to itself, from the most distant journeys from places such as Japan, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Brazil, India, sometimes in good health, sometimes sick, sometimes happy, sometimes depressed. My parents and my brother always lived here too, and I never had to fear for them in my absence. For 5 years, I've been in contact now with a family from Syria and Saudi Arabia who have been trying to start a new life in Germany. The father of the family, Jalal al-Ahmadi, is of Saudi Yemeni descent. The mother, Nur Akteb, is a Druze and originally from Syria. In Düren, near Cologne, their second place of residence in Germany, the two had a little daughter who is now 4 years old. Now they live in Berlin-Weißensee, the northeast. I got to know the parents, both poets, as part of a Versschmuggel, a poetry project at the Haus für Poesie, House for Poetry, and later brought them to the Weiterschreiben, a cultural project run by the Wir machen das, we do that project, which advocates for refugees and people from crisis areas. Contact with Jalal and Nur is not always easy, solely in terms of language. Rather, it is challenging and instructive. It often humbles me. When I speak to Jalal, which amounts to a sort of gibberish, I don't speak Arabic, he hardly speaks German or English, their families and their home countries are a constant subject. Jalal is very worried about them, but their relationships with their families are not easy, partly because the families now expect Jalal and his wife to be very happy in Germany, because no bombs fall on their heads, because there's always enough to eat, because their electricity doesn't get turned off. For family members and friends at home, whining, feelings of sadness, dissatisfaction, and forlornness are difficult to understand. However, this reinforces Jalal's and Nur's feelings of loneliness. After all, they are privileged and now have to be happy in Berlin. I admit, sometimes the two of them annoy me a bit. Why do they still not know that after 7 years of living in Germany, I say to myself, why can't they call back within a week if you received an exciting invite to read somewhere? Don't you realize that authors who've always lived in Germany also cannot take a lot of things in the cultural sector for granted? On the other hand, in situations in which I supposed that they would be irritated by strange German behavior and bureaucratic peculiarities, they manage better than I expected. They are incredibly generous and indulgent. I am often wrong in what I believe they think. I catch myself not understanding. I get annoyed at my own narrow-mindedness and sometimes remember my micro-suffering, my nano-foreignness, phases of loneliness in other countries, and the option of returning that was always given to me. Then heated debates about parallel societies and the dominant German culture, you remember these debates here, come to my mind, although I myself have lived almost exclusively in parallel societies abroad and have by no means accepted each country's respective dominant culture. In Serbia, this would have perhaps meant declaring sweatpants to be my favorite clothing item. Actually, in Belgrade, I wrote a cycle of poems there with the title Ode to Sweatpants. And going on, I would have to go on a strict diet, being happy in Serbia. In the Czech Republic, I would have had to drink their beer, basically lived in the pivnices, and develop a coarse sense of humor. In Krakow, I would have re-entered the Catholic Church and elevated a different kind of humble belief in fate. Bog tu napravi, God will fix it, to my Maxim. And of course, there, like in the Czech Republic, I would have had to spend a lot of time learning the national language, presumably without ever finding my Berlin repartee part of my identity. In Transylvania, I would have invented Saxon parents, Saxon grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents, and pretended to love strange porridge. And occasionally cultivated anti-Romany sentiment would have been expected from me. I would have managed in the Netherlands and the US, but not in Catalonia. In Amsterdam, however, I would have had to have behaved a bit more direct, more straightforward, not so complicated like a German romantic. And I would not be able to make the claim again that the Dutch language sounded cute. In the US, more of a continent than a country, it would depend on where I would adapt to which dominant culture. A cityscape like LA would have seriously disturbed my inner feng shui in the long run. Even if I didn't seclude myself by living abroad, but instead tried to approach my environment with openness, I did notice that in the places where I lived longer, the deeper friendships I made were with people with a migrant background. Even in the US, my good friends tend to be of migrant origin. With these thoughts and memories in mind, I wonder how marginalization works where I am part of the majority society. Many important voices from migrant Berliners, including Jalal Al-Ahmadi and Noor Akteb, have provided information on this in recent years, which has broadened the perspective. What I want to say finally is, safe spaces, yes, but there's always somebody outside the bubble. Ale wyszli je nekno mimo bublinu. Check. Ale zawsze nadciasane se czas poza banka. Something like Polish. And now, German of the Transylvanian Saxons. Da ist ein iemand von außen. Pero siempre hay algún fuera de la burbuja. Spain. Maar is altijd iemand buiten de luchtbel. That was Dutch. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tanja, for this grand finale. Well, we have some minutes left for Q&A. Any questions or remarks from the floor or from the panel? So who wants to go first?
I'm having a herbal tea now.
As we are waiting for questions, I'd like to add that kind of my hero in literary history, besides Goethe, is, and Thomas Mann, obviously, is Alfred Döblin, acquired the Berliner, and somebody who found a voice to write and speak about Berlin, and somebody who developed quite this Berlin humor, also when speaking about the heaviest things like his exile. And actually, one of the first meetings in Los Angeles after the flight between Döblin and Brecht happened, and Brecht wrote in his journal, in his diary, that Döblin still has his great Berlin humor. If I may say so, that's what I observe in your prose too, in your journalist work and other areas, that you a contemporary writer confronting yourself with present and urgent matters. And at the same time, you grant us your Berlin humor, like you did in this lecture. And I would like just simply to say I like that a lot. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much. Actually, I think, especially when writing about a topic like safe spaces, refugee, and all, exile, and this. Of course, I have to write with humor and a kind of self-irony about my own situation. Yes, of course. And actually, I believe that I also like Döblin very much, by the way. I believe that talking about serious subjects isn't more impressive or convincing when you write about this in a serious way. I mean, there is some some tragic in humor too. So that would be a big philosophical question now on humor, but I think it contains very different sentiments, and melancholy is a part of humor often too.
You know that sounds like closing words to me, on which we can reflect further on our own. Yeah, I think we can leave things here. Thanks again a lot, Tanja, to this great lecture and these insights and inspirations that we will take with us. Maybe also to the next event that features Felicitas Hoppe. Claudia, do you like to announce the next event again?
Yes, I would like to thank all of you, first of all, for participating. And of course, also thank you to the audience. I hope that you will all join us again on November 15th. And that's 10 o'clock LA time, 7 p.m. Berlin. And we will present Felicitas Hoppe, who will read and will be in conversation with Friedel Schmoranzer, Villa Aurora's head of fellowship programs.
I would also like to thank you very much for inviting me. And of course, I would like to thank Stefan for preparing this, for the good questions that really brought me to talk about my work. And and thank you very much to you, Claudia, too, for inviting me.
Thank you. Hope next time it will be in person.
Yeah, that would be very nice. I see the sunlight in your place. Here I'm in dark Berlin. would have been very nice to be now in LA. But thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.